You see the tree, you hear the traffic, you feel the texture of the chair. The world seems immediate, unmediated, simply there. This assumption is so basic, so quietly in place before any thinking begins, that it rarely surfaces as an assumption at all. Vedanta treats this as the first thing that needs to be examined. The claim is more specific. What you experience at every moment is not the external object itself, but your mind's internal imprint of it. You are seeing the mind, in which imprints of the external world are registered. Whatever you see, wherever you see, is only what is there in your mind. When you are deeply absorbed in thought and someone speaks to you, the sound waves are there, your ears are functioning, and yet you register nothing. And you come back a moment later and say, "Sorry, I wasn't listening." The sound reached your ears, but no knowledge occurred. Or you stare at a page while your attention is elsewhere. And after a paragraph, you realize no meaning has registered. Your eyes were open the entire time, but you saw nothing. In both cases, the external object was present, the sense organ was active, and still, no perception. What was missing was the mind's engagement, its modification, its taking the shape of what was in front of it. Perception is not passive reception. It requires something to happen inside, and what happens inside determines what you experience. The external object is, in a precise sense, the occasion for an internal event. You experience the internal event, not the external occasion that triggered it. Put on a pair of spectacles, and you immediately forget they are there. They become invisible to your attention, and you treat your seeing through them as direct seeing. The instrument vanishes into the act of using it. The same thing happens with the mind. It is so intimate, so constantly in use, that it disappears as an object and seems to be the seeing itself. We mistake the instrument for the perceiver. The mind's invisibility to itself is not a failure of introspection. It is a consequence of how close the instrument is to the one using it. Once you see that the mind must engage, must register, must participate for any knowledge to arise, what is this mind that participates in every act of knowing? What kind of thing is it? And how does something internal produce what feels like direct contact with the world outside? The mind does not know by its own nature. It is not built for knowing the way a lamp is built for light. The mind is built the way a tape recorder is built, a device that captures and registers, entirely dependent on something else to make it run. The inner instrument, a precise term for the mind including the intellect that evaluates and decides, belongs to the category of instruments, not to the category of knowers. Its material is prakriti, the primordial matter that makes up everything subtle and gross in the universe. The mind is in the same class as the eye, the ear, and the nervous system, all of them instruments, none of them the subject. Inert, insentient, unconscious. A stone is jada. A mirror is jada. The mind is also jada. The mind appears sentient. It chatters, worries, wants, and decides. But that feeling of aliveness is what needs to be examined. One reliable test for whether something is a knower or an object. Can it be known? The mind can be known. You observe your own thoughts, notice your moods, recognize when your attention wanders. Whatever is observed is an object. The mind, in being observable, declares itself an object, and therefore not the ultimate knower. It is an intimately experienced object, which is exactly why we confuse it for the subject. It is the natural outcome of the mind being so close that we look through it the way we look through glasses. And like glasses, the moment we stop looking through them and look at them, they are obviously objects, not part of the eye. An inert instrument cannot register anything on its own. Place a tape recorder with a broken recording head in front of a full orchestra. The sound waves are physically present, the machine sits there, and nothing is captured, because the instrument that converts external reality into an internal impression is not functioning. The external object's presence alone guarantees nothing. The mind, being jada, is in exactly this situation with respect to the objects of the world. The objects are out there. The sense organs are open. But if the mind does not undergo a specific internal change in response to the object, no knowledge takes place. the change is mandatory. The inert instrument must do something, must become something, before any knowing occurs. The mind is the instrument through which knowing happens. When the right conditions are met, the mind being inert raises an immediate problem. If it has no capacity to know, and yet knowledge clearly happens, something must bridge that gap. That bridge is a change the mind undergoes, a specific, directed transformation that happens every single time you know anything. What would it mean for the mind to remain completely still while still registering an object in front of it? Imagine a tape recorder whose recording head is damaged. Sound waves arrive, the machine is present, the tape is loaded, but nothing is recorded. The defect is not the absence of sound, but the absence of a functioning mechanism to receive and register it. A motionless, unmodified mind is in exactly this condition. The object may be right in front of you, the eyes may be open, the ears may be functioning, and yet if the mind does not undergo its characteristic movement, nothing is registered. A vritti is a thought modification or transformation of the mind, not merely a thought in the loose everyday sense, but the specific act of the mind changing its state in response to contact with an object. Without vritti, the mind is like undisturbed water in a basin, present, functional in principle, but registering no specific shape. The mind is, by its own nature, formless, nirakaramana. It has no inherent structure or specification. It is not pre-shaped like a pot that can only hold one configuration of liquid. It is more like molten metal before it is poured, fluid, unspecified, ready to receive any form. The external object acts as the mold. When the formless mind comes into contact with a jar, the jar's dimensions, contours, and boundaries become the mold into which the mind's modification is poured. The resulting vritti carries the exact shape of that jar, not an approximation, not a category, but the specific configuration of that particular object at that particular moment. This is why you can distinguish this cup from that cup, this face from that face. The mind has been molded differently each time. The molten metal analogy holds the teaching precisely. Liquid copper has no shape of its own. Pour it into a mold shaped like a lamp base, and it becomes a lamp base. Pour it into a mold shaped like a bell, and it becomes a bell. The copper has not changed its essential nature. It is still copper, but it has taken a specific form through contact with a specific mold. The formless mind, upon contact with an external object, does the same thing. The object is the mold. The resulting thought modification carries that object's exact shape. The mind cannot register the jar without first becoming, in a specific sense, jar-shaped. It cannot register a sound without first becoming sound-shaped. Every act of perception is an act of the mind, assuming a form it did not previously have. The mind is never passive in perception. It is always undergoing transformation. And because it is material, a product of subtle matter, inert by nature, this transformation is entirely mechanical, not sentient. The copper does not know the lamp base by becoming its shape. The modification alone does not produce knowledge. Something further is required to illuminate the shape thought and make it a living experience of, I know this. The mind does not sit inside the skull and receive a photograph of what is outside. Something must go out, make contact, and return shaped. This is not metaphor. It is the precise Vedantic account of how a single act of knowing unfolds. The mind, though it remains in the body, sends out a subtle beam of thought through the sense organ most relevant to the object. Before this beam reaches anything, it has no particular shape. It is a going out, a reaching toward. This outward movement, prior to any contact with an object, is called pramana vritti, the measuring thought, the instrument in transit. Think of a torchlight beam cutting across a dark room. The beam itself has no shape until it strikes a surface. It is light in motion, purposive, directional, but not yet defined by anything. The pramana vritti is exactly this: the mind going out through the eye, the ear, or the skin, moving toward an object before it knows what that object is. The moment this thought beam reaches the object and pervades it, it assumes the precise contour of what it contacts, the exact shape, the specific boundaries, the particular specification of that object, and no other. A pot thought forms if the beam strikes a pot. A sound thought forms if it travels through the ear to a voice. The formless becomes formed. At this point, the pramana vritti transforms into pramavritti, the thought that has now taken the object's shape. Vyapti means pervading. The thought pervades the object and in doing so removes what was blocking knowledge, the object's remoteness, its separateness from the mind. The gap between knower and known is closed by this operation alone. When the formless outgoing thought, like molten copper, is poured into the mold of the external object, what results is a thought shaped exactly like the object, a Vishayakara vritti, an object-shaped modification of the mind. Vishaya means object. Akara means form or shape. Vritti means modification. A Vishayakara vritti is a modification of the mind that carries the form of the object. The pot remains outside. What now exists inside the mind is a pot-shaped thought. That thought is the instrument through which the pot will be known, not the pot. This is why two people can stand before the same object and know it differently. The external object did not change. What differed were the internal modifications, the precise shape their minds took when the thought beam made contact. The knowledge was never of the object. It was of the mind's impression of the object. The mind does not travel physically in the way a hand reaches for a cup. The travel is the travel of a subtle modification. A shift in attention is not a physical movement, but is nonetheless a real event with a real result. The pramana vritti, going out through the eye, is the Vedantic description of what happens in that gap between looking and seeing, the active reaching of the mind toward what will become known. The mind now holds a shape, and that shape corresponds to an object in the world. But a shape thought is still an inert thought. The copper mold has formed, but it is not glowing. The form alone cannot produce the experience, I know this. Something must make that shaped thought luminous. The mind has sent out a beam through the sense organs, contacted the object, and assumed its exact shape. A thought in the form of a pot, a thought in the form of a face. The mechanical work is complete. But an object shaped like a pot is still just an object. A clay mold of a pot does not know the pot. The Vishayakara vritti, the object-shaped thought, is inert matter that has merely changed its configuration. Changing shape does not produce knowing. The mind is inert, but it exists always in the presence of pure consciousness. The Sakshi, the witness, whose nature is to illumine. Just as a mirror placed near a flame carries the flame's light across the room, the mind carries a reflection of the Sakshi's consciousness. This reflection is siddhabhasa, borrowed sentiency, not original sentiency. The mind does not generate its own light, it borrows. The moment the Vishayakara vritti forms, siddhabhasa floods that shaped thought, converting an inert object-shaped modification into the lived experience, I know the pot. The inert object-shaped modification becomes a lit cognition. The pot-shaped thought, illumined by reflected consciousness, becomes the experience, I know the pot. This second operation, where reflected consciousness spreads over the object-shaped thought and the actual knowledge event occurs, is called phalavyapti, the pervading of the result. Vritti vyapti removed the object's remoteness by the mind assuming its form. Phalavyapti converts that assumption into conscious experience. A mirror placed in a room reflects the light of a lamp, and that reflected light then falls on objects in the room and reveals them. The mirror did not produce the light. It carried it. The buddhi, the intellect, carries reflected consciousness from the Sakshi. Wherever the buddhi goes, whatever shape the vritti assumes, siddhabhasa illumines it. The mind does not plan this. The illumination is automatic, instantaneous, and uncontrived. You do not will your perception into existence. You look, and knowing happens. That effortlessness is the siddhabhasa operating without friction. Both operations, vritti vyapti and phalavyapti, must be simultaneously present for a single moment of knowing to occur. Every perception you have ever had has required both, without exception. The feeling that I looked and saw conceals an intricate double event, the mind morphing to match the object, and consciousness flooding that modification. The object-shaped thought, lit by reflected consciousness, yields knowledge. A mirror reflects a lamp only because the lamp exists. The Chitabhasa that makes every vritti a living cognition borrows its light from the Sakshi, the witness, the original source illumining the entire arrangement without itself moving. If you are sitting in front of a tree, light is striking your open eyes, and your nervous system is functioning normally. It seems you are seeing it directly. A mental object in between seems a workaround only for situations where the physical object is absent. Dreams, hallucinations, memory. But this objection collapses under one observation. When someone speaks your name and you hear nothing, not because the sound was absent, but because your attention was elsewhere, what has failed? Or when you read the same sentence 3 times and register nothing, your eyes moving across the words while your mind is occupied somewhere else? The physical object, the sound waves, the printed letters, was fully present. The sense organs were open and functional, and yet no knowledge occurred. The physical presence of an object does not produce knowledge. What is required is the mind moving into contact with that object and assuming its form, the Vichara vritti. Without that internal modification, the object might as well not exist for that perceiver. The blank look, eyes open, object present, mind elsewhere, is not a failure of the senses. It is proof that the senses alone are insufficient. The internal mental modification is not optional. It is the condition without which perception does not occur. The manasa vastu, the mental object, the mind shaped into the form of the thing being known, is not a substitute for a physical object when none is present. It is the mechanism through which any object, physical or otherwise, becomes known at all. The physical object is the mold, but until the mind flows into that mold and takes its shape, nothing is registered. You are never in direct contact with the tree in front of you. What you are experiencing is your mind in the shape of a tree, a vritti that has assumed the tree's exact form, illumined by reflected consciousness, producing the experience, I see a tree. The tree itself, as it exists independently of your perception, remains on the other side of this process. What lands in experience is always the mind's imprint. It is a precise description of the only route through which any object enters your experience. The route runs entirely through the modification of your own mind. Every step examined so far has one thing in common: change. The mind sends out a beam, morphs, gets illumined, collapses back. Thought rises, takes a shape, yields its knowledge, and dissolves. The entire machinery of knowing is a sequence of modifications. And here is the question the machinery itself forces open. The mind changes to know the pot. But who knows that the mind changed? That question has a precise answer. The mind, including the Chitabhasa, the reflected consciousness that animates it, is an object. It is experienced. You know when your mind is agitated. You know when it is clear. You know when a thought arises and when it subsides. This knowing of the mind states cannot itself be another modification of the mind, because that new modification would need yet another knower to know it, and so on without end. The regress stops only when you locate what requires no further illumination, the Sakshi, the witness, the pure consciousness that is already and always self-luminous. The Sakshi is not a new entity introduced from outside the argument. It has been operating silently throughout the entire process. The Chitabhasa, the reflected consciousness that floods the Vichara vritti and makes knowledge possible, is borrowed from the Sakshi. The mirror borrows its light from the sun and sends it wherever it turns. The sun does not travel with the mirror. It stands still, self-luminous, illumining the mirror's every movement without itself moving at all. The ahamkara, the ego, the empirical I, is exactly this mirror. It is the mixture of the inert mind and the borrowed reflection of the Sakshi. It appears to know, appears to decide, appears to be the person having experiences, and it does function in that role, but only because it is lit from behind. The ahamkara is the false knower. It requires a process, a modification, a change of shape to know anything. It gains knowledge by undergoing vichara, transformation. The moment the process stops, the ahamkara's knowing stops with it. The Sakshi, by contrast, is nirvikara, changeless, undergoing no modification. It is svayam prakasha, self-luminous, self-evident. the light in which all the ahamkara's processes appear and are known. When you know the pot, the sequence is the mind takes the shape of the pot, siddhasa floods that shape, and the experience I know the pot arises. To restate that accurately, the Sakshi illumines the mind that has assumed the shape of the pot. The words I know the pot are the ahamkara's translation of something simpler. The Sakshi does not say I know, it does not say anything. It illumines. Clay is present when the pot exists, and clay remains when the pot is broken. In the interval between two thoughts, that gap most people assume is blank, consciousness does not disappear. If it disappeared, you could not know the interval. Something witnesses the gap itself, that something is not the next thought. The knower of the gap cannot be part of the gap. It is the Sakshi, present in every cognition, present when no cognition is occurring, unchanged by either. The misidentification, taking oneself to be the ahamkara rather than the Sakshi, is the natural result of the siddhabhasa being so bright that the mirror seems to be its own source of light. When the ahamkara falls out of first-person status and into its actual position as a highly intimate object, what remains in the first person is not a new experience to be attained, not a state to be entered, but what has always already been the case, the changeless awareness in which thought after thought has risen, taken the shape of the world, and dissolved, without once disturbing the light that made each of them visible.